This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rapin. Joining me this week, two vampires I accidentally let into my house, and now they're living in my attic and refusing to pay rent. Zach McCrary.
What is up, Mike? Glad to be here. Happy spooky season.
And Nick White.
Yep, that's where we're at. Not paying rent.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. I've got a mortgage, and you guys are using all of my electricity. But we're here to talk about comic books today. I'm going to say before we get into things, I'm just going to throw out a content warning for folks. Today, we are talking about some of the scariest books that we can think of in comics, and some of that will involve things like gore and probably self-harm and things of all sorts of scary bits. So if that's not your vibe, you may want to skip the second half of this episode, maybe even some parts of the first half of this episode, but just calling it out. That's what we're going to be talking about today. But let's get into things. I have two legally mandated questions that I have to ask you, and that is, how have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Zach.
Man, that is a tough question because I've read a lot of comics this week, and that's been great. Unfortunately, the reason is because I've had COVID.
Oh, no.
And so through the hell of having COVID-19, I have read a lot of fun comics. Everything else in life is great, but this week sucked.
Yeah. Well, what did you read? And did you read anything good that was able to like settle your body as you were trying to recover from this?
Settling my body is not a good way to put the things that I read this week. Because with it being October, like I'm a huge horror guy in general.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, over on my show, the comics that we love all month is Spooktober. And
yes, sir.
I love reading horror comics because I think they're some of the best comics being put out today. I said it, I'll lay it out there. And one of the ones that I read this week is a book from Vault Comics called The Autumnal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written by Daniel Kraus, art by Chris Sheehan, colors Jason Wordie, letters by Jim Campbell. This book is, man, Vault Comics, if you're looking for spooky bangers, man, this is the place to go. Like that, if you like that kind of stuff, go check out Vault Comics.
Yeah.
The Autumnal, it's a story about a town with a secret. It's like a gorgeous suburban New Hampshire town of Comfort Notch. And like when you hear that name, even it's like something's wrong with this town, clearly. Like it's too nice. And,
yeah.
And it all, you know, it's one of those things where everything's perfect, but it comes at a cost, like one of those kind of stories. And our main character, Kat, and her daughter, Sybil, go to this town because Kat's estranged mother is dead and left her daughter everything. Kat's got no memories of her mom or the town. She spent like the first 8 or 9 years there, doesn't remember anything, but it all kind of starts to come flooding back when she arrives and starts to unravel the mystery of why her mother sent her away in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it's one of these stories that's filled with mystery. And as we start to get the breadcrumbs of what's going on, you start to get that kind of like that same feeling that you get from a Junji Ito book, like we talked about last time. Like these normal people are in over their heads and they're never going to make it to the surface once the truth is like fully revealed. Like you just start feeling that. And it's like it's a story about generational trauma and how that passes itself down and continues until someone either breaks the cycle or the cycle ends the family. But it's done in this really cool, magical horror story kind of way with gorgeous watercolor art from Chris Sheehan and a beautifully written story by Daniel Kraus. And this one actually now ranks among some of my favorite horror comics. The crunchiness of the story is that good. And there's a lot to unpack just in the characters alone. And that's all before you even get to the really wild witch in the woods legend kind of story. And so The Autumnal, man, 100%, 2 thumbs up. Go check it out.
Okay. See, this is one of those books that I always wanted to check out, but the cover, very much like the series Colder, which I do want to talk about later, is absolutely disgusting. And I'm like, if that's what you're pitching me on, I don't know if I want to dig into this. Like the cover to this book, again, warning folks, this is very gross, is like a woman in a pond and there's like sticks going into her eyes and her nose and her face. It's like awful. It's really, really gross.
Oh man, all of the covers to each issue were like beautifully, like some of them were done in like charcoal and stuff like that, and they're all grotesque with cool looking skulls, and it's all like autumn themed art. Right. It's really neat.
Right. So it's like very much the opposite of what I think we like to talk about here on I Read Comic Books every fall season, which is just like warm, cozy fall vibes. Yay. And today it's just like death.
Pretty much. Yep.
Well, I mean, if you're saying this book is solid, you're not the first person to say that, but Zach, I'll take your word for it. Maybe this is one of those books I go into the month of November and say, like, let's get just really scared and let's read something. So this sounds good, but it's been on like one of those, oh man, I've been meaning to check that out list for a while. So thank you for the extra recommendation on this. Plus, folks in the Discord are saying it's a pretty solid book. So
Yeah.
I trust them as well. Nick, though, what about you? How have you been? What have you been reading? All that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I want to talk about that stuff, but ever since Zach said spooky bangers, like the only thing I could think of is like a Halloween themed British breakfast dish.
Ooh.
Yeah. It's like spooky bangers. Yeah.
Some black pudding.
Right.
Nick, you've got to do it in like a British accent if you're going to do it, man. It's spooky bangers, ain't it?
Don't tempt me. Don't try this. I think last time I was on the show, you tried to get me to do a Russian accent, and I'm not wading into any current international conflicts.
Go get some spooky bangers in a pint, mate.
When I was over there, that's how everyone talks. And they're like, that's not how we talk, but that's literally how everyone talks. They just don't want you to know. That. So all of our, oh God, you guys did it again. Here we go. You made me fall into this trap. All of our United Kingdom listeners are not going to be pleased. And last time people were mad, they're like, you forgot about Wales. And it's like, look, everyone's watching Welcome to Wrexham now. I think everyone knows about Wales now. So our Wales audience, Ryan Reynolds is in your corner. You don't need me. It's fine.
Right. Right.
That's fair.
That is fair.
Beyond that,
Mint Mobile and Wales. That's all. Like, Ryan Reynolds has got your back.
And Aviation Gin, but I think he sold that. Yeah. So he also sold his Mint Mobile. Let's talk about all of Ryan Reynolds' investments over the years. Let's list them all.
Welcome to the I Like Ryan Reynolds podcast.
This is now Motley Fool.
Listen. I'm gonna turn this around. Ryan Reynolds was Deadpool comic book. Nick, what did you read?
Ooh. Oh no, that was good. Well, just briefly, in terms of what's been going on, just want to cover this. Zander, put in the ESPN theme right here. I talked to them. It's legal. You can borrow it. It's fine. They said like 20 seconds. You can do it. Things are good. Lions are playing this weekend. Actually, they're not playing this weekend. They're playing on Monday. And Formula One is in Mexico, and Max Verstappen has to have bodyguards because everyone hates him there. So it should be really interesting.
I'm gonna just pause on that and say in the break we're gonna talk about something that's very F1 related, but not right now.
Yeah,
Nick, I want you to tell us about a comic book, please.
Sure. Yeah. So I read Giant Robot Hellboy #1. This is the first of 3 issues. It's a miniseries. The story is by Mike Mignola. The art is by Duncan Fegredo. My goodness, I sat down and listened. Good. I went on YouTube. I do this every time. I go on YouTube and I look at other interviews with the person and then I write down the name, but I forgot the pronunciation here. Colors by Dave Stewart, letters by Clem Robbins. Yes, it's basically the usual typical Hellboy gang on story, colors, and letters like you would come to expect. For those unaware, this book basically came about because Mike Mignola was doing some sketches during sort of the peak of the pandemic, and I think they got called like the quarantine sketches, and I'm pretty sure most of them ended up getting compiled into a book that was sold or it's in the process of being built.
Yeah.
And basically this drawing was really well received by a lot of the people that were really paying attention to these, and at some point they decided, let's just make this a book. And because Dark Horse is more or less the house that Mike built. If he says, I have an idea, he doesn't need to finish the sentence. They just go ahead and say, yes, it's approved.
Yeah.
And then if the word Hellboy shows up anywhere in the next minute, they're like, oh my gosh, we'll make an action figure and we'll put out some merch and maybe we'll adapt it into a movie that may or may not be well received. So
ain't that true?
Which I mean, look, like, Mike Mignola, I appreciate the guy. I feel like he's very humble about things, all things considered. I mean, the man has had 3 movies, and he's not a big, of a non-Big 2 artist. A Big 2 character. I don't know if anyone else can make that sort of claim. I noticed it here. I've noticed it on a lot of his other recent books. He doesn't give himself, or the editors don't give him, a writer credit. He seems to always be getting a story credit because
Sure.
that's a way of basically, as he said multiple times, I have a 2-minute conversation with the artist. I list about 3 bullet points and I hang up the phone and they draw the book.
Hmm. But
And
here's the thing about that, though, is even with all of that, you say, like, it sounds like you're trying to imply that he's extremely hands off about his books, but regardless, I feel like that is enough for them to put out some pretty cool comic books, all things considered, right?
well, I think he's an artist that trusts artists to be an artist,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He's been there. He's done writing for his books. He's done just storyboarding. He's done books where he's strictly been the artist. I think he has a good understanding and trust
Hmm.
in people, and I think that this book is more or less pretty much exactly the same. So in terms of Figueiredo, he might not be the most household name, but he actually was the main artist on Hellboy for a couple years. He drew the Darkness Calls arc. He also drew the Wild Hunt arc, which was largely what got adapted into the 2019 film, which, I mean, we won't touch on the film. But what's really interesting is that Darkness Calls was actually the very first Hellboy miniseries that did not feature Mignola on art. So this guy was the very first person after Mignola had drawn that book for years and years and years. I think probably from like 96 through '06. It was probably like
Hmm.
a whole decade. Um, this was the first guy on the book following him. So that's a pretty big deal. He drew the book for a couple years. What about this book, though? Right. So it's a sketch. People like the sketch.
Yeah.
He says, let's do a book. Some people are like, well, that's kind of stupid. It was just this weird sketch. And, now it's this whole comic. Can you really, draw a whole comic about that? And I think really the criticism isn't valid. I think this is just a situation where we got to see the kernel of the idea like be created, right?
Sure.
Like we saw where it began and then evolved. And I think a lot of times, just the inciting moment or the kernel of an idea can be something small. It can be something stupid or, goofy. And just most of the time, we're not privy to what that moment is, right?
Hmm.
It's just that
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
this moment, we saw it, right? Um, and in terms of like, what is this? It's exactly what you're paid for, what you paid for. Like many of those manga where the title is like 2 run-on sentences like, "Oh no, I am a teenage boy trapped in the, Troll King's dungeon and all I have is a frying pan." And you're like, "Well, I know what this book is about," right? Like
Yes.
this is Giant Robot Hellboy and it's exactly Giant Robot Hellboy,
Sure.
okay?
Kaiju, mecha, they're in right now.
Yeah,
Totally.
oh,
Let's roll with it.
Totally.
100%, right? So, like, the conceit of this book, and like spoilers for issue 1, but really, is this really a spoiler at all?
Yeah.
Hellboy gets captured. He gets wired up into this contraption that looks like it's straight out of Dr. Frankenstein's, laboratory. Because we're British now, apparently. That's how I
Yep.
want to say that. We discover that this machine is linked to this giant robot that shares Hellboy's likeness. The robot gets dropped off on some island that happens to be home to the Jim Hanks equivalent of Godzilla. That's a Tom Hanks joke. And a
Yeah.
fight starts. That's the whole issue. That's the whole issue, okay?
I
That's
love it.
not a knock. It flows well. It relies on the artist to tell the story. It doesn't get in its own way. Why but yet while it flows really well, it reads really fast, it's intuitive to the eyes in terms of the panel flow, and it looks great. There are still some little interesting questions here, like why did these people capture Hellboy? Why did they pick him? Why did they build a mech that looks like him? And most importantly, we have this character who's sort of surveilling him on this island and is sort of the eyes and ears for the scientists. While she's surveilling him, she's going into this old abandoned facility trying to recover something, and we don't know what that is. So there's some interesting little lingering questions here, but again, not the most complicated read. The art looks amazing. It seems like, Mignola manages to find these artists that look an awful lot like his own style, but they have
Hmm.
their kind of own take on it. This guy's no different. And I think the one thing he manages to nail that a lot of Hellboy imitators don't always get is the level of the inking and the shading that goes into Hellboy in terms of like the shadows on the face or like the sort of weight on like the cloak. and the reflections on the the guns and everything. I feel like that's actually pretty well done here. You've got all the fact that everything is covered in dirt and grime, and everything has flaked paint and rust on it, and everything just feels kind of old. Yeah, really enjoyed this book. Yeah, I would say anybody who's looking for something dumb and fun, it's definitely that, and it just looks great doing it.
Yeah, you sold me. I mean, I feel like every once in a while I take a risk on a Hellboy book and then I read it and I go, "What the fuck was Nick thinking?" And
Yeah,
this one though, I feel like I could jump in; it would be perfect.
yeah,
So
100%.
very
Yeah.
cool. Very cool. I mean, genuinely looking this up though, it does look beautiful. I was looking up for what's his name? Duncan Fegredo's art looks amazing. So yeah, definitely gonna have to try this one. Either when it gets collected or maybe I'll just grab the single issue. Because it's not $6.99 like other single issues that we're talking about, but we're not gonna talk about that right now. I'm gonna talk about something else. That is Koguchi Magazine #1. I've been terrible about keeping up on comics recently. I can't even explain how many weeks behind on my single issues and how many books I've dropped just because I realized I'm not reading them. But I did actually read a Kickstarter book. Like last week, I read a Kickstarter book. This week, I read a Kickstarter book. That is Koguchi Magazine. This is a huge anthology. It's like 146 pages full of a half dozen, maybe almost a dozen comics by a bunch of different creators. I'm going to put them in the show notes so you can take a look at this just because it's a huge list. But yeah, it's really 146 pages of awesome all in one book. The feel of this book, I genuinely cannot describe. Like, there's no digital edition of this book, unfortunately. But in true like anthology magazine style, this book has like a really nice, crisp cover that's floppy while also being like very like tough, like thicker cardboard, which is nice. And I feel like there are some anthologies out there that think, oh, we'll just take this book and we'll give it the exact same dressing as a trade paperback. And to me, I feel like that is not the right vibe. Like last 2 weeks of the show, I've talked about vibes on comics, and I don't know how else to explain it, but this book has like the right feel. It feels like a magazine. It doesn't feel like a comic book. And that to me puts you like in a different mindset when you're sitting down for this book, because you're not expecting it to be just like overloaded with comic books. You're kind of expecting something else, and I feel like that's exactly what this book delivers. Like, it's broken up in a very intelligent way. Each book has a however many pages each story is, and each story begins with a very huge black page that just has the name of the book and the creator, and ends with another full black page with like the little icon that the creator drew for themselves and like a little quote or something, like some thought that they may have had. It very much reminds me of how Shonen Jump puts its books together, which I really, really like. There's a bunch of other places that do similar style books, but Shonen Jump is just what I think of. So I really, really enjoyed that. Like, and the pages for this book are huge. Like, this is bigger than your traditional trade. It feels like, again, magazine style, which gives it like a totally different like feeling overall. The pages themselves were definitely made to be in like a smaller format, and so when they're blown up, it just feels like you're looking at a much bigger comic book, which is nice. So like, to me, when I see big word bubbles and I see big panels, I feel like I'm going to read the book faster for some reason, because like there's just like this, oh, this is a children's book kind of thing. And I know that's not what it is, but that's kind of how I felt going through it. So I literally sat down and read this entire magazine in a sitting because it's just like so easy to go through. And I think that also goes to say a lot of the stories in here are really good. And to be completely honest, some of them are really bad. There's like a couple that are just duds, but that is okay when it comes to an anthology magazine like this almost disposable way of approaching comics. Like, this Koguchi Magazine #1 is not something I'm gonna be like, I need to put this in a Mylar bag and keep it forever because it's gonna be worth money. This is just a thing that has stories in it that I could pass off to my friend, and it'll get beat up as like people go and read it and just kind of take it however they want. And I really, really like that. But yeah, there are some really good books in here. There's really good stories in here. There's a lot of experimentation happening in terms of like panel layout and like fonts, and it's the whole book's in black and white grayscale. But even then, I feel like some people were trying to tell like very odd styled and formatted stories with this, just because this is the type of thing that next issue, maybe they're going to do a completely different story. Maybe next issue they continue the story. Maybe next issue they're not even in the magazine. And I really, really like that. I think my only annoyance in this book is, despite the good stories, bad stories, whatever, like, that's actually not a knock on this. I think the only annoyance I really had was there was a handful of typos in this book, which is kind of frustrating. If only because like it's super glaring to me, the reader, but I'm sure that the person writing the book or whoever's editing, they've seen these scripts 100 times, so that it's easy to maybe miss a letter or something like that. And that happened in a couple stories. Really, really minor annoyance, but it's still kind of like, I want to reach out to be like, hey, you guys don't have to pay me, but let me just proof these before you send them to print. Get like a brand new set of unseen eyes just because. But yeah, I really, really like this. I think this is a Kickstarter book that I backed it to get the first 2 issues of this magazine. I'll definitely be getting 3 and 4 whenever they announce that, if this book keeps going. And I think Kickstarter is like the perfect place to do a book like this, because you don't have to worry about subscription numbers. You don't have to worry about, is this even going to sell? Do I have to distribute to someone? It's like, no, we're going to sell directly to the people who supported this thing. And I think that's perfect. I want to see this keep going. So I'm going to continue to support this, whether the stories are good or bad, because I love the idea of this format and I really, really want to see it succeed. And I hope everybody else out there hears this and keeps an eye on Koguchi Magazine, or Koguchi Press, I think is the name of the actual company making it, because they've made some really, really good books before. But this anthology magazine is new for them, and I really want to see them move forward with it. So issue 2 is coming soon, but really I'm in no rush. I just want this to show up on my door when I need something that's totally different than everything else that I'm reading. So I'm very excited for that.
That's really cool. The idea of an anthology comic via Kickstarter, I really like, because I love Kickstarter comics because you get to see new people cutting their teeth and getting into like figuring out how to write comics. And the idea of a lot of people all getting to throw something in the hat and get their name out there in, like, because that's the whole point of anthologies, is cutting your teeth and figuring it out, and doing that via Kickstarter. I really like that. You get to see a lot of fresh faces and a lot of fresh takes on things, for better or for worse sometimes. But yeah, anthology books are fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I feel like Kickstarter actually does work really, really well for anthologies, but the anthologies that I've backed in the past have felt like, oh, this is just a trade of comics. This book intentionally gives you a different feel. And I know that that's like a really weird thing to describe, and I keep fucking saying it, but like, truly, if I could show you 2 trades side by side, or two anthologies side by side, and one looks like a comic book and the other looks like a magazine, and the magazine to me is more appealing to try new, unique things. So anyways, we could talk about this more later, but let's move on. Zach, let's bounce back over to you. What's one other book you've been reading?
Oh man, so I read the collected edition of the Bone Orchard Mythos 10,000 Black Feathers from Image Comics.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is written by my favorite team in comics, bar none, Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino. This is their baby. If you're unfamiliar, it's also colors by the incomparable Dave Stewart. Dave Stewart's amazing, and letters by Steve Wands. Got to give credit where credit is due. If you're unfamiliar with the Bone Orchard Mythos, folks, it's this shared universe where they're creating self-contained horror stories as one-shots, graphic novels, miniseries. So far, there's been a one-shot called Prelude, The Shadow Eater, an original graphic novel called The Passageway. Currently, there's a 10-issue miniseries called Tenement being put out. And then there's this book, 10,000 Black Feathers. Again, it's all Lemire and Sorrentino just doing their crazy stuff together. 5-issue miniseries, 10,000 Black Feathers. What I love about the duo of these two is that their approach to horror is so cerebral and really plays on the inner turmoil of what it is to be a flawed human being. And yet the elements of the supernatural are still there. They ground their work so well in its humanity while giving you something completely fantastical. Actually, I'd say like fantasy horror describes this story really well. It's about a fantasy author named Trish who comes back to her hometown on her book tour, not to promote, but to kind of face off with something that's haunted her since her childhood. We get to see how she deals with it and like the evil that's plaguing her, and that took her best friend Jack from her as she tries to find that friend and defeat the darkness. But, that sort of thing, like I said with the last book, comes with a cost. Everything comes with a cost in horror, because that's what horror is. The art is phenomenal. Sorrentino, for my money, and just at me, bro. Go ahead and at me, bro. He's the most creative panelist in comics today. The stuff he does with page layouts is stunning and belongs in a damn museum. Yeah, I'll pull out the Indiana Jones. That belongs in a museum. And Lemire constantly praises how he gives Sorrentino something, and the dude just unravels it and makes it 1,000 times cooler on the page. And there's this interesting transition within the art where we see flashbacks to this woman's childhood with her best friend, and and as they're working together on building this fantasy world and writing fantasy novels, because that's how they became friends. And the art slowly changes. It starts with this nice pastel colors and thin line work, and there's like an innocence still there. And as the story goes on and these kids start to grow into their teens, the art changes to that signature dark and kind of muddled Sorrentino like realism. There's like a realism to the way he does things that I love.
Hell yeah.
But not for everyone. That's the interesting thing. So as people change, the art changes for them, if that makes sense. So like when a character has like some kind of trauma or like something goes on with them, it switches to creepy Sorrentino realism from the pastel thin lines. So not all the characters are doing it at the same time. And our last character left in kind of the bright like the bright, or not bright but brighter pastels and thin line work is Trish. And she's the last one to kind of lose her innocence. And it takes a long time throughout the story for her to get to that. And we're flashing back and forth between what brought her here and her in the present. And of course, in the present, she is fully in Sorrentino, look now. And it's really cool how it transitioned. And this is like horror in the highest regard, like elevated stuff. The Bone Orchard Mythos isn't like cheap scares and slasher villains and such. It's all about like inner demons coming to life in front of you, and about broken people being thrust into situations that are far beyond anything they could fight off or run from. And there's like an air of hopelessness, and that's scary in and of itself.
Okay. There's first off, so you listed like 9 different books that are associated with this.
Yes.
How do you read all of this? Because I feel like that's the thing that's really put me off of like trying to toe into this Bone Orchard Mythos stuff, is like there's a bunch of it and I don't really know how it all fits together. And I will say, like, I've talked to Nick about this. It sounds like it's kind of confusing.
Yeah, they promoted this as being standalone and yet interconnected. And as far as I'm at in this, I don't fully buy into the interconnected elements. I think, at least as far as I'm at, and I'm most of the way through Tenement, I have yet to really see a lot of the interconnected elements that are supposed to be there.
Interesting.
And for me, and Zach, feel free to push back on this. The volume you talked about, what is it, 10,000 Black Feathers, for me is probably the weakest element. And I think one of the weird things about it, and you kind of got at this, is that Sorrentino's art, first off, and hat off to Sorrentino on this, I had to double check to make sure there wasn't a second artist working on this book.
Same.
Because I was convinced that the lighter, brighter, pastel, fantasy, book within a book elements were actually possibly being done by someone else. And when I found out it was Sorrentino, I was so used to Sorrentino's normal style that style was normal and conventional to me. And it was the weird, bright fantasy shit that was weirding me out and making me super uncomfortable. And I was like, what the fuck is this shit? Go back to that dark crap.
Yeah.
So it almost sort of flipped poles for me. And I was like, well, this is weird. This is kind of odd to look at. It creeped me out in a way, because I was like, this isn't you.
What did you do with Andrea?
Now, knock on the door 3 times to tell me you're okay, please. But
is Lemire hurting you?
Yeah. But I've enjoyed it so far. I think part of the issue for me is having it follow Gideon Falls, right? And obviously there were some things in between. But for me, obviously aesthetically and also tonally, it feels pretty close to Gideon, and yet it's not connected to Gideon. I don't know. I'm not going to damn the guy by his own past successes, right? But it does feel pretty similar. I think I liked the OGN the most, even though the pricing of it was not without controversy at the time.
The Passageway was a hefty price for an original
like
graphic
90
novel.
pages. Yeah.
But I have enjoyed everything so far. I do agree that whatever they are intending to eventually like give us as
start weaving
breadcrumbs
together.
like whatever that is, they haven't done it yet. And I don't know, and maybe that's on purpose because they don't want to be like bogged to, like giving us threads, or maybe there's something there that is so minute that we won't notice it until they tell us it's there. I don't know. But so far, like each of them, I think have been good in their own way. I would agree with you. I think the Passageway is the best of the ones that have come out. And Mike, as far as knowing where to jump in, you don't need a place to jump in. You can just, whichever one you feel like checking out, because they are so self-contained, you can just read whatever you want. And they're not difficult reads as far as, like the style or anything like that.
It's Jeff Lemire,
yeah,
right?
Mike, there aren't big words. Don't worry about it, buddy.
Yeah,
You'll
we know.
be fine.
Your simple brain can handle it.
I read all of the Black Hammer stuff. Maybe this is the
Mike's
pendulum.
like, listen, I've read books with 5 words with 5 syllables.
I know how to say things.
Did you guys not just hear about how I love big pictures and big word bubbles? Come on, like
did you not hear? I listed off fanographic books for you. Fanographic books.
Yeah,
big hardcover books.
This is a Jeff Lemire book, so like I'm not too worried about that because but I think this is a pendulum. That was not a diss on Jeff Lemire. I'm in terms of ease of reading. So my thought is like this is maybe Jeff Lemire's pendulum swinging back to try to get away from like the extremely combined like Black Hammer universe that he did, to say like, hey, I'm going to build something that's connected but not in the same way, right? Because Black Hammer was like so tightly interwoven that like really if you missed any of those miniseries that were in that series, you would lose chunks of the story. And I think that was intentional because he wanted to do a big book, but instead he just did a series of small books that were all very connected. But I don't want to talk about Black Hammer. God, we have to move on. So Nick, I don't even want to go to you, but I have to. What's another book that you read very quickly?
Yeah. Although Mike, I would say on the Bone Orchard thing, read The Passageway. If you want to read a book about someone abandoned on a small island with a lighthouse, that alone terrifies me. So I do want to briefly mention, and really briefly, because I'm not even done with the book, folks. I haven't even finished it, right? I started reading the first volume of a manga called The Fable. This is by Katsuhisa Minami, who wrote it and drew it. This was published by Kodansha. It ran from 2014 to 2019. It was collected in 22 volumes. It turned into 2 live-action movies, and it's actually going to be an anime next year. Kodansha USA only licensed it starting last year, so we're just starting to see this in the States now. So The Fable is about this legendary killer who literally goes by The Fable. To be fair, he's not like super conceited. That was a name given to him. He didn't come up with it on his own, right? And he's like the ultimate weapon. He can kill anyone in an infinite variety of ways in under 6 seconds because that's how he's been trained, right? Blah, 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 blah. And the book kicks off and it's like you see him and he's going on a hit and he murders all these guys and it's like pretty brutal. Like he's like, one guy tries to shoot him and he grabs another guy and pulls him in front of him and like uses him as a shield first. And then he like fires back at the guy, but he uses the human shield as like a silencer. So he's like firing through the guy to kill this other guy. And you're like, this is like, I mean, okay, like I see the cover, you're holding a gun, you look pretty cool. Like, I guess I probably expected you to murder some people. So it starts out, it's pretty brutal, pretty violent. And then he goes to meet with his boss and his boss is like, hey, like, it's like a performance review and the guy's like, so let's talk about this year, right? And he's like, how have the last couple years been? And the guy's like, yeah, it's been fine. He's like, do you know how many people you've killed in the last like 5 years? And the guy's like, no. And he's like, well, it's 71. It's 71 people. You've killed 71 people. It's kind of created some attraction to like, there's too much attention on us. Like, you need to lay low. We're going to have you and your assistant lay low. So he's like, here's your passports or whatever, here's your IDs, here's your insurance cards, here's all your shit. Like, just, live here for a year, learn how to blend in. It'll be valuable to like your ability to like fit into different settings, so they just explain it away. And they just drop him in this area. And more or less the plot is like, this guy is so capable of murdering people. And now we're going to put him into this more dangerous area of the town. And just tell him to just not fight anyone for a year. And his boss is like, look, if you kill anyone in this year, like we will put you 6 feet under too. So like, you got to live in this dangerous place for a year. Don't murder anyone, please. And that's the opening. Right. That's the opening conceit of the book, right? And so I'm already loving it so far. Like, obviously, this guy, like, he can't calm down, right? He's like hiding bullets in different, like, in like a little container of nuts, and he's like breaking down his gun into different parts and hiding it around different parts of the house. And his assistant is like, you gotta calm this down because, the boss is gonna get mad. So between that book and The Way the House Husband, I think I just really enjoy books of super tough guys being asked to not be super tough guys. I think it's like my manga. It must be like my manga sweet spot. I don't know.
Yes.
But so far, I'm enjoying this.
Did you grow up loving like Mr. Nanny and like like that old Hulk Hogan
Kindergarten
movie,
Cop.
Kindergarten Cop, like that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Do I watch like The Pacifier and
The Tooth Fairy?
Yep.
Yeah, like
Yep.
Right. Tough guys and tutus. Like, is that like tough guys being not tough guys? Yeah, is that my thing? Maybe it is. But
let me talk about one book really quick before we go on for forever today. Nick, your definition of brief is maybe the funniest definition I've ever heard in my life, and I love you to death, but
I think that was like 3 minutes, but we'll let the listeners get back to me. Get back to me on this.
Yeah, call us ircbpodcast@gmail.com.
Redefine the definition of brief on Urban Dictionary and just put a picture of me and then just put brief in quotes underneath.
Yeah, be the great Wikipedia heist of 2024. So I also read The Flash #1. This is the 2023 Flash that came out recently. This is written by Cy Spurrier, art by Mike Deodato Jr., colors by Trish Mulvihill, letters by Hassan Otsmani Elhau. Danny, basically, on our Discord, summed this up perfectly. Weird shit happens when you run really fast, and that is basically what this book is about. I really couldn't sum it up any better. But I feel like every time I think I know a few things about The Flash, I do just say, like, hey, let's try to read a Flash story. And it's like I'm diving into the entirety of Doctor Who, knowing nothing, despite me thinking I understand how things work. There's so much history that's relevant to the story that I can only hope that eventually things will make sense. That being said, though, this first issue does set up the dynamics of all of the characters well enough that even if you don't know the intricacies of the various Flashes or Mr. Terrific or Gorilla Grodd, by the end of issue 1, you at least get a feel drawn to whatever extremely weird thing Cy Spurrier is trying to do with this book. And you kind of understand how all of the characters are going to play their part, at least from the start. In an interview with Comics Beat, Spurrier said, "I've never had a hard time generating ideas. If anything, one of the criticisms I get is that I try to fit too many ideas into a single page of comics, and I think that's bollocks." I'm going to say it the most American way possible. I think there should never be too many ideas, but that appears to be okay in The Flash. I can get away with it. Nobody goes, hang on a minute, you've got too many ideas, calm down and chill out a bit. So yeah, it seems to fit. And I totally agree. This is a thing that I love about Spurrier's work in general, right? I think going all the way back to my beloved X-Men Legacy run that I will never, ever shut up about, up through all of the weird stuff that he's done through the Krakoan era of X-Men, everything that I've read, and his Hellraiser books that he's done. Constantine, Hellblazer, different series. His Hellblazer books, it's a totally different vibe, and it's always something that feels like just jam-packed with stuff. But what works the best about The Flash is that The Flash is running a mile a minute. Everything is happening super fast, and so to throw a ton of different ideas on multiple pages over and over, it totally makes sense for the series. Like, the bit is the Flash thinks faster than anybody else, right? Except for maybe Superman, which that's a whole other discussion. And so, like, to have Wally West or Barry Allen or whoever's on the page having a ton of thoughts and a bunch of ideas going on at once, it doesn't feel unnatural for that character because that's kind of their shtick. But anyways, I love this book because it has an incredibly dark feeling from the get-go compared to other Flash books, which I feel like is very bright, like the bright reds and yellows and stuff. Deodato Jr.'s art is, I think if you've read any other book that he's worked on, has always been kind of dark. There's a lot of shadows. It's very like Andrea Sorrentino, where there's like this very strange panel layout and characters get these weird shadows and dark looks to them. And I feel like that's the vibe that they were going for with this book because it's supposed to be kind of like a cosmic horror. And you find out in this first issue that there's something going wrong with the multiverse, because that's what's always happening with the Flash. And but it turns out that the multiverse is like turning speedsters into, this is a little spoiler, but it's turning speedsters into like these cosmic abyss, like monstrosities. And I don't know, I feel like it's very different than a lot of the other Flash stuff that I read. The most recent thing that I read before was the Joshua Williamson and Carmine Giamencio run, which was a fun book, but I dropped it because I ultimately just don't care that much about the Flash. But this is Cy Spurrier, so I'm at least going to try this book for a little while. So all I'm saying is this issue is dark and weird. And I feel like it's right on brand for today's discussion, and I'm very glad that I read it. Like, I honestly think I might stop reading this on DC Infinite Universe and instead start picking it up. But like,
oh wow,
we'll see. I don't know. Big 2 books, so it's a whole other discussion. But
I don't normally read Flash either, but I thought I that team made me curious about this, and now you have sold me on checking out that book.
It's cool. If you can at least read number 1, like if you dig number 1, I feel like this whole series is going to work for you. And I say that having only read number 1, but I've heard that after issue 1, it gets even weirder, and I am totally here for that.
Yeah, hell yeah. Yeah, I like Cy Spurrier. He always brings something weird to the table.
Exactly. But let's move on. Let's talk about books that we're going to read soon, books that are on the top of our pile, whether they're new, they're old, or just something you're trying to read off of your shelf. We've got some thoughts, but before I get into that, we've got some folks hanging out with us on Discord today. They're also reading books. CK is reading Damn Them All Volume 1. Danny is reading Ultimate Universe number 1. Stephanie is finally reading Volume 1 of the Department of Truth. At least that's what they said to us. Brian is reading Starfinder, Angel of the Drift number 3. All very exciting stuff. Stephanie, I'm so excited that you're reading the Department of Truth. I can't wait to hear whether or not you like it, because I feel like that book is not for everybody. But anyways, let me pitch this over to you, Zach. What is on the top of your pile?
Well, what's on the top of my pile as we head into November and I try to clear my brain is Okinawa, the graphic novel from Susumu Higa.
Yeah.
A bit of a change from what I've been reading lately, especially as we get further into the topic later.
Yes.
I've been looking forward to checking this out. I've never read anything by Higa, but I like what I've heard so many good things. I love the art. It's so simple and the colors are so vibrant and beautiful. And the idea of it is just fascinating to me. Again, I haven't read it, so I can't give you specific thoughts, but here's a little blurb from Amazon for anybody who might be interested. This heartbreaking manga by an award-winning cartoonist examines the history of Okinawa and its military occupation, an essential manga classic presented in English for the first time. I love stuff like this.
Same.
And I'm thrilled to sit down and read it and finish out my COVID time on something like this.
This is a big, thick book from what I've seen. It's a big book, so you have to let me know how it is, because this has been on my to read list. Fantagraphics sent an email about it a couple weeks back, and I was like, I should buy this. And then I looked at my shelf of dozens of unread books, and I said, okay, maybe once I finish a couple other books. But if you say it's good, Zach, I'm going to buy it. So
I'll keep you in the know, man.
Thank you. Nick, what about you? Or actually, let me talk about my book first really quick before.
Yeah, what do you got for us, Mike?
I know. Let me. So I'm going to read Frieren, Beyond Journey's End, Volume 1. This is by Kanehito Yamada. Basically, this is a book about an elf mage named Frieren and her courageous fellow adventurers that have defeated the Demon King and brought peace to the land. But Frieren will long outlive the rest of her former party. How will she come to understand what life means to the people around her? So Kate Lamphere, a bunch of other people have recommended this book. There's 7 volumes out now, maybe 8. And it seems to be this really interesting spot of a fantasy story that's slice of life, probably has some very emotional beats to it that are hey, I'm the only elf in my party and all my friends are going to die before I'm really even middle-aged. This idea, I think, it's implied in a lot of books, right? Tolkien has a whole thing about it. I feel like we never really discuss it in the main stories of Tolkien's books, but it's a thing, right? Where Legolas has lived for 1,000 years before Lord of the Rings, and he lives for another 1,000 years after Lord of the Rings or whatever, right? Because he is just an elf. So how does a person who has that or has that type of longevity in their life live with all of their friends and family, passing? So I'm really excited to have my heart broken. This is going to be an emotional ride, and I've heard that it's very good. 7 volumes. I picked up volumes 1 and 2 and 3, so I'm ready to dive right in.
I want to turn that into a D&D character.
Okay. We're going to talk about this in the break, but we're going to talk about the One Ring game. That's a whole thing. But also I was going to mention, I was going to pick up Ultimate Universe number 1, but I'm holding the line at not paying $7 for a 40-page digital issue. I don't buy Marvel books. I don't buy Marvel books in physical anymore because their paper is garbage, and honestly, they're not worth anything unless you're willing to spend that $60 for the variant cover, and even then, it's I don't even want to talk about that. So $7 for number 1, not me. So I'll read this on Marvel Unlimited. Anyways, Nick, let's get to you, and then we'll go to the break.
Yeah. So for me, my pick of books coming out next week is definitely The Space Between. That's that's DMB circa like 2003.
Oh my
The
god.
Space Between #1. Wicked lies we tell and hope to keep you safe from the pain. I said I wasn't
Tripping
gonna do that, did it
bellies.
anyway. Uh Low key love that song. Anyway,
Uh-huh.
so this is also a book by Boom Comics. It's being written by Corinna Becco. It's being drawn by Danny Luckert. The solicit is as follows: from the minds of Hugo and Eisner nominated and New York Times best-selling writer Corinna Becco, who did The Expanse, the comic, and acclaimed artist Danny Luckert, Ghost Lore, comes a genre-defying story aboard an interstellar generation ship in the space between. Available in November. On the starbound arc known as the Dodana, the populations of workers live in strictly segregated social castes during the journey that will take multiple generations to complete. But everything changes when a pilot from the upper tier named Revla, sorry, falls to the lower levels and meets Les. As the two grow closer, they learn that they will have to risk everything, not just for themselves, but for generations to come on the Dodana. Every issue in this limited event series features a brand new pair of protagonists, each facing off against the new generation's trials and tribulations. This sweeping sci-fi epic about love, survival, and liberation will inspire and enthrall fans of The Expanse and Battlestar Galactica. Like, first off, I do have a rule that I will buy any comic named after a Dave Matthews Band song, so I'm still waiting for Ants Marching. We'll see if and when that happens. Insta buy right there.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I'm sure some people know Becco for her comics, her, rightly acclaimed work on the Expanse comics, but I still remember her for her work on Invisible Empire, which she co-wrote with her husband, Gabriel Hardman,
So
who
good.
was also the artist. Yeah.
Actually, I
And
think it's Invisible Republic. Sorry, Nick.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. That's something different. Don't know what I did there. And if you want to talk about like sci-fi books that are like, hey, like we have hyperspace and like sci-fi laser guns, but also guess what? We still live in a far-flung future where racism and fascism and discrimination and all of these uncomfortable things we're still navigating and dealing with these days are still ever present, and the future still hasn't worked these things out. Becco like really has a strong grasp on those concepts, and based on this solicit, I think this book will be no different.
Yep.
And I'm pumped. I think this will be a pretty interesting book, and the fact that it's an anthology and like multi-generational, it sounds really ambitious.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I feel like Becco, every time she's on a book, I at least like always want to check out the first issue, if not the whole series, because I feel like you said, her grasp on like how to tackle these tough subjects within sci-fi without making it seem like the end is nigh, there's no point for the future it's a very hard line to walk, and she walks it super well every single time. That's what made Invisible Republic so cool. I feel like their work on The Expanse is probably just as good. And this I did not know this book was coming out, and I have to check it out.
See, this
Yeah,
is why
absolutely.
this is why I love being on this show and listening to this show, because that is not a name that I am familiar with, and now I want to go and find everything about her.
Yeah, you should. You should. I think she also did a run on Green Lantern that was supposed to be very good.
Yeah, I think it was the that like Earth One sort of
Yes.
like standalone OGN sort of little imprint, if you will.
But yeah, you know what? Before we dive again into a bigger topic, let's take a quick break. We're going to talk about horror books after the break, but for now, I guess we'll be back in just a second. Before we get in the second half of our show, I've got a little bit of housekeeping to do here. As always, you can follow us on the internet. You can follow us on Instagram at TikTok and Discord. We've got a Goodreads. We've got a YouTube channel that's doing really well. All IRCB podcast, youtube.com/@IRCB, because we got that cool handle. Check us out there. And if you want to support us, if you want to do something like last week's episode where you get to commission an episode of the show, or you get to hear a special series like A Better Batmobile, Giant Days of Our Lives, Mike's X-Men Blind Box, and so many other things, like over 120 different Patreon exclusive episodes of podcasts. You can support us at patreon.com/IRCB podcast to get access to all of that stuff, plus schedule updates, top of my pile post early access, so many other things. Check it out there, patreon.com/IRCB podcast. But we're here today to talk about some of the scariest stuff in the world, comic books. So Zach, you kind of said, hey, I really want to be on this Halloween episode because it's technically before Halloween as we're recording this. What was going through your head? What makes you love scary comics so much? And why did you want to talk about them today?
Man, I think it really goes back to when I was a little kid. My brother exposed me to horror movies long before I should have been. And I just fell in love with the genre. And I love being scared. I said on my show this past week, I love being scared while knowing that the guy running at me with a chainsaw isn't really going to wear my face at the end of it. You know what I mean? Like, I love that feeling. And so when, over the years, I just fell in love with the art of horror and doing good horror that really pulls something out of you and makes you think and gets into your brain and makes you worry about things just from having those thoughts put into your brain. Like, I love a good jump scare, but I love this like era of like the high horror kind of thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And comics are rife with that kind of stuff. There's still schlocky, but actually you mentioned Cy Spurrier earlier, and there was a great Cy Spurrier quote that I saw for an episode I recently did on the book The Rush, where he was saying that he thinks with comics, you have to go deeper with horror because jump scares are not possible. Like, you can't do cheap tricks.
Right. You can't turn the page and then someone goes, oh God.
Exactly. Unless they're really skittish.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, so you have to really play with people's thoughts. And that's the way that he said he likes to do horror is take things that you will then think about later and will bother you. And like, that's his version of horror. And I think that is what comics do best when horror is done right in comics.
Totally.
So that's why I was excited to do this. I've been reading a ton of horror comics, and yeah, I was like, I have to be on this episode.
Yeah, no, tell us about one of the books. So we talked a little bit in the first half about some of the scarier books that you've been reading, but what was another one you wanted to bring up for today's discussion?
Okay, so I've got two in this category, and you're gonna see a theme because for this I wanted to grab books that are about something that legitimately does scare me.
Oh, okay.
And like, that is the exorcism genre.
Ah, yes.
And it's not like, it's weird because it's not because like I'm a like super religious person or anything, but the idea of something taking over me and me not having any control over that is a scary, scary idea, which I think is why I love those movies. I love reading the comics. And the one that I want to tell you about first was a book called Roman Ritual. And this is a 4-issue book from a small company called Amigo Comics.
Okay.
It is owned by El Torres, the writer. Like, this is like his publisher that he puts out his books on, Amigo Comics. He's out of Europe. And the artist was Jaime Martinez. And Roman Ritual, 4-issue run, real hard to find. But it's worth the time. It is about this priest who is doing exorcisms in like South America because he's been excommunicated for some things that he's done in his life. And it's like the situation where the church comes calling back and they're like, you're the only guy for this case, that kind of thing. Like, and it sounds lame, but then when you realize that he's the best exorcist they have, and the problem that they have is that the Pope is possessed by a demon. The art is grotesque. I mean, grotesque. And like, the first image you see of this possessed Pope is just horrific, and the images are horrific. And as the story goes on and you start to realize what's really going on within the church and why this is happening, and like, because there's more to it than just the simple idea of the Pope being possessed. Like, there's more going on, but it is just so well done, and it's so concisely done too. It's 4 issues, but I feel like this could have stretched on for like 10.
Interesting.
But El Torres did such a good job of making this whole thing come together in 4 issues, and it's creepy, and it's gross, and it's well thought out, and it's just such a fun little romp. It's a fun 4-issue romp.
Fun little exorcist romp.
Yeah, fun for all the kids. Bring the family.
Right. Oh my gosh. So how did you come across this book?
I didn't. Man, I feel like I'm always just plugging my show, but I did an episode on it. My friend Matt Suter, shout out to him. He's a big horror nut, and he specifically loves anything dealing in religion. Like so, I wanted him on the show for my first Halloween, and he was like, "Oh, I got something for you." And we talked about it, and I actually got to talk to El Torres after the episode dropped. He and I had a discussion, and like I just fell in love with the way this guy puts horror together. And this book specifically, like, yeah, I found it through Matt, and it's such a well put together book that like I will tout it till the end. Whenever somebody wants something creepy and horror, yeah,
Gotcha.
Roman Ritual.
Okay. Well, Nick, I'm curious. Can you top that? What you got on your list, bud? What's something that's actually creepy that you've brought to the table today?
Oh God, like that would probably have to be, and I feel like at this point, a bunch of people on this show have read this, but maybe not enough. Did you hear what Eddie? Oh God, it's Gein?
Geen.
It's Geen. They even make a big point in the book about the pronunciation.
Yeah.
By true crime writer Harold Schechter and Eric. Is it Eric Schechter? I thought maybe it was Howard Schechter and Eric Powell. It's definitely Eric Powell on art. This is what I get for just writing last names. Yeah, I know this was talked up by a couple people. I know Mike read it a couple years ago.
Yeah.
I most recently read this for the first time maybe 2 months ago. It's just you read it cover to cover, you don't stop.
Yep.
Like, I would be shocked to know what people are just like, they get like 20 pages in and they're like, all right, whatever, and just put it down, because it's so terrifying and compelling. And of course it's all real.
Right. I mean, I feel like some of it is Schechter kind of adding a little bit of his own personal conjecture, but like it's allowed. I feel like it's allowed because of how much he's studied and like understood this person, right?
Okay. Right. And admittedly, there are certain aspects of what Geen did that they're not entirely sure.
Right.
Like, did he actually do this? Did he not? And of course, like, one of the things that you always end up asking, I say you always end up asking, this is one of the things that like true crime podcasts and whatnot, which I do listen to,
which we are turning into after this episode, by the way.
Exactly. Yeah. This is our new pivot. Is once you catch the individual and you're like, well, you did this crime, it sort of inevitably becomes a question of like, well, what was the first crime? Like, where did they really start? Like, how many do we not know about?
Right.
And
right.
With Geen, there is this question where he's been linked to quite a few different other instances where people aren't sure. And I guess we probably should get into this, I guess, a little, which is like in line with the actual title, like, what did Edward Geen do? And it's some pretty terrible, rough and tough, gross shit that I believe he says at one point some of it inadvertently inspired some of the visual elements of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yep.
And yeah, I don't want to say anything more about the book because it's terrible and it's shocking. And as long as you at least know that that's what you're getting, I think you'll be okay. It's still terrifying, but it's also it's not super salacious. It's pretty like methodical and critical and goes through things beat by beat in the same way that I think you have with why can I never think of the name of the book? With Dahmer. My best friend Dahmer.
Yeah, my friend Dahmer. Yeah.
By
Derf Backderf.
Derf Backderf, right. So I think it's in the same vein where it doesn't like get super salacious or, lean into things in a way that just seems kind of unsavory.
Yeah.
No, but it's compelling and it's terrifying.
Yeah, I think there's like almost like a clinical approach to how this book is done in terms of the narration, but then Eric Powell does like some absolutely tremendous work with his artwork, right? And I'm not someone who's very familiar with Eric Powell's work, but if I'm not mistaken, he did the Goon over at Dark Horse for a long time. So he has this really strange, like, shaded, like bulky style to everything that he does that's really, really cool. And it works super well for this book because there's some dark things in here, and clearly Eric Powell is not afraid to draw this kind of stuff. So I totally to me, it's so funny that you bring this book up, Nick, because this book is not scary to me at all. It's fascinating, but it's not scary in the same way that I think like Roman Ritual would probably scare my pants off, because I can't explain demons and exorcisms. I can explain Eddie Gein, right? Like he's just a wild like person who is absolutely awful. I can understand the horrors of man, but not demons.
Well, I totally get what you're saying, right? Because like this guy, he's not out there, and we don't, right? It's not like Zodiac where it's like, who was the Zodiac? Is he still out there? Right. Like, when will he strike again? Blah blah blah, right? Like Ed Gein is dead, and he was caught, and all of that.
Yeah.
And but I think with Gein, there are some unanswered questions. And I think one thing that the book gets at is this lingering question, minor spoilers at the end, of like, was he really crazy? Was he not crazy? Was it an act?
Right.
Like, how performative was it, or wasn't it? And just sort of those lingering little threads are kind of, that stuff is sort of creepy to me.
Yeah, I get you.
I think that for me, there is a little bit of scariness to that kind of stuff. And I think it's the reason that I like true crime as much as I like horror, is because for me, it's like there are people that are still out there like him. You know what I mean? Like that is a thing that exists in this real world. I don't know if demons exist. I don't know if they can take me over. I don't want to know, but I know that there are people who will wear your face out there. And
maybe.
And that's horrifying because they could be anybody. I'm looking at you, Brian.
We thank Brian for his proof listening today.
Yes, thank you, Brian.
For today, I guess a book that I'm always interested in, that scares the pants out of me because off of me, is Infidel. This is by Pornsec Pichocet, and Aaron Campbell on art. Colors by Jose Villarrubia. This book is extremely haunting. I think like very similar to Zach, your first book that you mentioned here. It's about a house that's haunted, and you don't know if it's like really what it is. Like honestly, I feel like the first half of this book is just tense. It's so tense because everybody except for our main character, who's an American Muslim woman, is like certain that something is wrong here, right? And I feel like, and the reason I bring up the description of this character is because she is also a person who is being like very subtly discriminated against in the story, and she's like, how can no one else see this, right? Like, and so there's like this beautiful parallel between like, do you see the haunting of this house, but also do you see the things that are being done to me, as she is being both haunted and she is both being discriminated against.
Oh wow.
But it's a beautiful thing to the way that Pichocet like puts things together in this book, and I was so scared reading this. Like it's very rare for me to feel so scared by a book, but I feel like there were moments of like, and I think I talked about this on the show before, where I was like living in a house that kind of had like a similar shape, and I was like, oh god, like are there things in the walls? And that's exactly what this book is about. This woman can't figure out what's going on, and I also feel that kind of abject terror at 3 a.m. where I'm like, was that a shadow? Was that my cat? Am I gonna die right now? So yeah, I really love Infidel for that reason, because I think that Aaron Campbell's art does a good job of putting you in a certain mindset. And the writing is great, but it's really the art and the color in this that gets you into like the feeling of like, oh God, what's happening, right? And I really enjoyed just like how they were able to put me in that mindset and then successfully get me out of it by the end of it, right? Like I feel like some horror books end on like this, and they never know what happened, right? Like, and it's maybe not so ridiculous as that, but it's still like a question mark ending, which to me is a little like unsatisfactory sometimes. I feel like Infidel does go through the entire phase, or all the steps of like, hey, let's introduce you to the world, let's scare the living shit out of you, and let's let you realize that while even if this mystery or whatever happened isn't completely solved, at least our main character was able to like get out, and there isn't really a question mark of is she going to be okay. And I appreciate that
Cool.
from beginning to end. And this book it's a great read. I don't know if I'll read it again because it genuinely scared me so much. But it's really good. And yeah, I pretty much try anything that this creator team will do. So yeah.
I want to read that. Like that's another one that's been in my queue for a long time. I love that
the covers to that book is so good too. I will say, just look up the covers to Infidel; they're amazing. But sorry, you were saying.
Oh, the parallels of the idea of why doesn't anyone believe me? That I'm being haunted, and why doesn't anyone see what's happening to me and the racism that I'm experiencing?
Mm-hmm.
Like the parallel of that is just a brilliant idea that I don't know I've ever seen done before.
Yeah, it's. I mean, if you like this creator, Pornsec Pisha I think also did a book called the Good Asian, which is a like noir book, very much covering like similar topics of like racism in the world and how a character tries to basically navigate survival while also understanding that like all the deck is stacked against them. Great book as well. But yeah. Zach, though, did you have another book you want to talk about?
I did. And like I said, I have a theme for this, and it is a book. It's actually only for one issue out right now from Mad Cave Studios. It's called The Devil That Wears My Face. You can already tell where it's going.
Yeah.
And this one is really cool because it takes place in like the 17th century, which I love that it's a period piece, and it's a similar idea where within the church there's stuff going on. The Pope is very sick, and there's kind of like the rumblings of the need to move on, like to a new pope and that kind of stuff. And there's this one priest who is kind of he's saying too much and is taking a lot of crap for it. And they decide, hey, there is this possession going on that keeps killing all the priests that are trying to help this kid. Let's send him to try it because we just want him out of here. And like that's clearly what's happening. So they send this guy, and he is trying, and it's this serious demon, and there's this gorgeous art. It's got a very similar kind of vibe to Roman Ritual in that, right? Like it's very dark, like all of the art is done in such a beautiful way with so much shadowing, and it really gives you the vibe of everything being lit by candles. And
nice.
I love that. And it really adds to the ambiance of the book. And there is screw it. I'm just going to tell you, like, it's worth it because I think you should go pick up issue number 1 and then keep it going, folks. But the idea basically winds up that this demon finds a way. It's not a deal where this priest has to fight the demon out of this guy that he went to save, because the demon jumps, if you know what I mean. And that's all I'm going to say.
God.
Yeah. The demon doesn't stay in one person. It jumps. And now suddenly it's elsewhere.
And this is a book by our good pal David Pepose, who we've had on the show a couple times, which is very exciting. So I didn't realize that he had a new book out, but I did know that he had a book out. That's a lie, because I'm pretty sure Danny talked to him very recently on his show. All this cross-pollination of podcasts. How dare you guys? We're only here to talk about our podcast. But no, it's really cool. I'm excited. I didn't think to pick this up. I forgot. So yeah, I'll have to grab a copy.
It's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous book. Alex Cormack art. Very nice.
Very nice. Nick, give us one more book really quick here before we jump into the listicles you posted in our doc for today.
Sure. I think this one's definitely better known than others, but
sure.
It's been a couple years. Maybe some people never picked it up. I would definitely say if you haven't read Harrow County, you should really give it a shot.
Hell yeah.
Is it the absolute scariest thing you've ever read? Probably not. It's like a 5 on the scary scale. You know, 5 standard scary units out of 10. And of course, this is Cullen Bunn, who tends to inject a Southern perspective or a Southern locale into a lot of his works.
Yeah.
With Tyler Crook on art, which honestly, I could just say Tyler Crook on art, and most sane, reasonable people would be like, I don't care. Maybe it's him and he's depicting paint drying and grass growing, and that's fine, and I'll pick it up. It'll look good. Because you should. That is a perspective you should hold.
Yes.
But you know, it's Bunn. drawing on this locale and a lot of the legends and myths and stories he heard growing up about witches and these different little creatures that live in the woods. Um, but I think for a lot of people, it's just refreshing to see sort of urban legends and these mythological creatures and these different little, horror stories that don't have the typical ghost, goblin, werewolf mythology and, iconography. It really looks and feels and has a perspective and whatnot that we're not used to associating with kind of like ghost stories and scary spooky tales, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it just looks beautiful, and it just looks absolutely beautiful, and terrifying. And yeah, I would recommend this book. There's quite a few volumes. It actually got like a follow-up series.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, I can't recommend that one enough.
Yeah, I remember a while back we did like a reading of volume 1 of this, I think, for something. And it's interesting because I feel like Tyler Crook's art is extremely haunting the same way that like some of the, I'll say, like scarier like Renaissance
Yeah,
style paintings can be, where you're kind of
Totally.
it's
like,
simultaneously beautiful and yet unnerving.
Yeah.
exactly, that's
Even when it's not a horror book, right? Like Crook has done other genres and things like that, but even then, the art is sort of like there's something unspeakably unsettling about it.
hmm. Yeah, that's the thing that like got me about that book is I feel like there's nothing, like you said, it's like a 5 on the scale of horror out of 10. But like there are pages that you're just like, oh, if I saw that in real life, that's it for me. I'm done. Like my soul would leave my body. And I think that is the power of Crook's art, even if the book on the whole isn't like absolutely totally scary. So I appreciate that pick. Thank you for bringing that back to my attention, Nick. I don't know if I'm going to go back and read it, but I'm glad that other people know it exists.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. I mean, Cullen Bunn and along with Crook's art is like a perfect combo for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess like to wrap up today's discussion, Nick, you dropped some listicles on us. New York Times 5 spooky Halloween comics for horror fans, and Entertainment Weekly's
Yeah.
15 spooky comics to get you in the Halloween spirit. Just looking over these articles, I'm curious to know, we're people that have read quite a bit of horror comics, I think. How do you guys feel about these lists? Do you think that these companies actually know what the hell's going on, or should people just be listening to our podcast for all the recommendations they need? Curious.
I mean, just the fact that the New York Times decided that they wanted to weigh in on this, and I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
like, all right, let's take a look at this. And I mean, Ice Cream Man is one of their 5,
Okay.
and like, I
We
mean,
respect
obviously, totally unbiased opinion, right? Totally respect that.
Mhm.
I get it. But then there's just some other stuff here where I'm like, I've never even heard of these things.
Collection of EC comics for some
It's
reason.
specifically Ray Bradbury comics. That's what's cool
Yeah.
about it.
The New York Times is like, all right, we want to bring these old like 40s and 50s comics, but we somehow have to tie it so that people understand the relevancy. So let's find Ray Bradbury. People know that name, so we'll make it all work together with that. That's my guess.
Guys, we have an editorial mandate. Only half of the books can be completely out of print. All right, just half. All right.
Yeah. I feel like the Entertainment Weekly article is interesting because they too also included an EC Comics group, because I feel like it's one of those things. There must be some mandate that you have to do that. But they also included Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, which, like, I don't know if you guys were a 13-year-old in the year 2001.
Little edgelord, 13-year-old edgelord.
When like Invader Zim was everywhere, and like you could go to Hot Topic and you could get comic books specifically. You could get Squee and Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, and like everyone was wearing those big Jinko jeans with zip off knees and chains and stuff. Why those books are not scary at all. They're just like, hey, I hate everything, and guess what? I'm gonna kill somebody because I hate them. And if that's scary to you, maybe, I don't know, watch a TV show or something. I don't know, man. Like, I can't imagine that book being remotely scary to anyone. Maybe that's just me.
I will say, I was looking at these lists, and I was looking at a couple other lists that I didn't include, and maybe it's just been a long time since I read it. or maybe it's just the fact that it was a longer series where some of the volumes did really feel different and look different than others. But I was surprised to see Sandman on a lot of lists. And
because they got it, Nick.
I was kind of like, do I not really remember this? I mean, yes, the what's the guy's called? The Corinthian? The guy with the eyes that are teeth, right?
But I will tell you that Sandman went one ear out the other for me.
Okay, sure. Okay, that's
maybe Sandman's on the list because it's so scary at how hard it is to follow the book story.
Yeah. Maybe Sandman is on the list because they know nobody finished volume 1, and they can say whatever they want about it.
I've heard from people who've heard me claim that I don't like Sandman, that you got to get past volume 1, Mike. And I say that to people when they sit down to watch Parks and Rec, so I totally get it.
I think Sandman gets included on the lists like this just because somebody looked at the art and was like, "Well, that's kind of scary," and that's it.
I don't want to give people that little credit. I feel like there is probably a justification if you get into Sandman. There are some spookier elements. Like Neil Gaiman is capable of writing a comic book that's scary, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's true.
I just never got that far. But Sandman is a weird pick given how many other scarier comics there are out there. I think that's maybe the point that we're actually arguing here.
I also saw From Hell on a lot of lists, and I was like, this is a bunch of people who probably you want to talk about books people couldn't finish.
No, but Nick, you also did mention, did you hear what Eddie Gein done? And I feel like From Hell is the same thing. It's just a lot more narrative insertion.
From Hell is so much more clinical. It is like
it's Alan Moore,
and it's
clinical.
So big, and it's like, we get it, Alan Moore. We know you researched this for 10 years. We know. But yeah, I mean, okay. I don't think that should be on list.
I just need to point out that it's kind of freaking me out that the cover of From Hell looks like Donald Trump with bloody hands holding a knife.
I'm not going to do a Donald Trump impersonation.
No, don't do it. Don't you do it.
Okay, I'm not going to do it. I won't do it.
That's post-credit stuff. Okay, so I think all said and done, I feel like our recommendations are maybe better than these listicles.
Yeah.
I feel like, but
that's the takeaway that should be there. Yes.
I'm curious to know what other people read this month. As far as horror comics, if you did read any, I know some people just jumped right into fall vibes and witchy vibes, and I totally get that. So if you read some of that, send us an email, because we usually do an episode on that. There may be one coming later this year. We'll see. But otherwise, to wrap things up, I appreciate you guys coming with some very scary books and some very interesting books. I did not mention the last book that I had on my list, which was Nice House on the Lake #1. Just the first issue, not the rest of the series. The rest of the series is not that scary. That first issue, though, absolutely terrifying.
Oh, wow.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, folks that are getting our show notes for this week on Patreon are going to see some covers that I also thought were scary, so look forward to that. But otherwise, next week's show is going to be really interesting. It's going to be me, Brian, and Nick talking comics and such. Maybe we're going to talk about food and comics. I don't really know. We'll see.
Sure.
But otherwise, thank you guys for your time today. Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. Zander lives in the flame of every jack-o'-lantern lit after Halloween. I want to say thank you to Zach and Nick and Brian today. Thank you, Brian, for proof listening. Thank you to everyone for hanging out with us live on Discord. You're fantastic human beings. And if you got this far in the show, thank you. You are amazing. Until next time, though. Comics are good, and so are you.